My name is Tessa Calloway, and I'm 31 years old, and I want to be clear about something before I tell you any of this. I am not a dramatic person. I don't exaggerate for effect. I don't perform pain for sympathy. What I'm about to tell you happened exactly the way I'm going to say it happened, and I need you to understand that, because some parts of it are going to sound like something you'd read in a story someone made up. But this is not made up. This is my life. And it almost wasn't. 4 years before any of this, I sat at a folding table in the break room of a pediatric clinic in Columbus, Ohio, eating a granola bar that had expired 2 weeks earlier because I hadn't had time to grocery shop, and I opened an email that made me go completely still. It was from the University of Michigan School of Social Work. I had been accepted into their clinical mental health counseling program. Full-time. 2 years. Ann Arbor. I read it 3 times before I let myself exhale. I had wanted to be a licensed clinical social worker since I was 19 years old, and sitting across from a school counselor who looked at me with the kind of attention I had never once received at home, and I thought, I want to do that. I want to be that for someone. It took me a decade of detours to get there. Community college first because 4-year tuition was out of the question. Then a bachelor's at Ohio State that I stretched across 5 years while working 30 hours a week at the clinic. Then a year of saving, budgeting down to the dollar, eating lunches I packed at 6 in the morning, and never once ordering delivery, keeping a spreadsheet I checked every Sunday like a ritual. I had $28,000 in a savings account with my name on it and a plan I could actually execute. I had lined up a graduate assistant position at Michigan that would cover half my tuition. I had found a roommate through the program's Facebook group, a woman named Adeze who seemed kind and organized and already owned a vacuum cleaner. I had given notice at the clinic. I had a moving truck reserved for the 3rd Saturday of August. Everything was in place. My husband was not. I need to explain something about my marriage, because this story doesn't make sense without it. My husband and I had been together for 6 years, married for 3. His name is not something I'll use here because I don't want to give him that. I'll just say this. He was the kind of person who needed to be the most important thing in every room, including rooms he wasn't in. When good things happened to me, there was always a pause before his reaction, a half second where you could see him recalibrating, figuring out how to respond in a way that kept the spotlight where he preferred it. He loved me, I think, in the way that some people love a thing they own. Attentively, possessively, with very little interest in what the thing itself actually needed. When I got into Michigan, he smiled and said, "That's great, babe," and then immediately started talking about a promotion he'd been passed over for at work. I let it go. I told myself he was processing. I told myself he would come around. He did not come around. Over the following weeks, the conversations about Ann Arbor became what I can only describe as a slow erosion. He never yelled. He never made ultimatums. He just raised concerns. The timing wasn't ideal. His job was here. His family was here. Long distance was hard on people. He'd read that somewhere. Had I thought about what this would do to us? Had I considered that 2 years was a long time? Did I really need a graduate degree to do what I wanted to do? Or was there something closer, something that didn't require uprooting everything? Each conversation ended with me reassuring him. Each reassurance cost me something I couldn't name but could feel, a slow leak somewhere in the chest. I kept packing boxes. I kept telling myself it would be fine. I kept believing that the man I married would eventually choose to support the person I was trying to become. The moving truck was 2 weeks out when I came home from my last official day at the clinic to find my husband sitting at the kitchen table with my laptop open in front of him. He looked up at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before, not guilt exactly. Something more calculated than guilt. Something that knew it had already done what it was going to do, and was now simply waiting to see what happened next. I asked him what he was doing. He said he'd been on my email. I said I could see that. He said he'd replied to the financial aid office at Michigan. He said he had told them I was withdrawing from the program for personal reasons. He said he'd also emailed the graduate assistant coordinator and declined the position on my behalf. I stood in the doorway of my own kitchen for what felt like a very long time without saying anything. Then I said, "Tell me you didn't," he said. "You weren't going to be happy there. You weren't going to be happy away from home." "I know you, Tessa, better than you know yourself. This is better. You'll see." That is a direct quote. I have replayed it so many times that it is engraved somewhere in the permanent architecture of my memory. I know you better than you know yourself, as if my own mind were a territory he had surveyed and claimed. As if 4 years of working towards something could simply be rescinded by someone who had decided he knew better. I did not yell. I did not throw anything. I walked to the bathroom, closed the door, sat on the edge of the tub, and I stayed there until I heard him go to bed. The next morning, I called in sick to a job I had already left, and I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee I didn't drink, and I tried to figure out what had just happened to me. He had sent those emails from my account. He had used my words, or a version of them. As far as Michigan was concerned, I had withdrawn, voluntarily, of my own free will. The graduate assistant position was gone. The financial aid package would be voided. The roommate I'd found had already started looking for someone else because she needed certainty. The moving truck reservation could be canceled. Everything I had assembled, carefully and methodically, over the course of a year, had been undone in an afternoon by someone who sat at my own kitchen table and called it love. I spent 3 days in a state I don't have a clean word for. Not depression exactly. Not rage exactly. Something flatter and more disorienting than either. Like the ground had been removed, and I was still walking because I didn't know what else to do. I ate because eating was a thing bodies required. I slept because exhaustion eventually overrides everything. I went through my routines the way you go through airport security, mechanically, waiting for it to be over. On the third day, I woke up at 5 in the morning, and I lay there in the dark, and I thought about the version of myself that had opened that acceptance email in the clinic break room. The way I'd gone still. The way I'd read it 3 times. The way I'd let myself feel something clean and unguarded and real. And I thought, I am not going to let this be the end of that. I got up. I showered. I dressed. My husband was still asleep. I took my phone and my keys and I left the house quietly, and I drove to a coffee shop 3 miles away that opened at 6. And I sat down and I opened my laptop and I started writing. I wrote to the admissions office at Michigan first. I explained as clearly and calmly as I could that I had not withdrawn from the program, that an email had been sent from my account without my authorization, that I had documentation of my acceptance and had been actively preparing to enroll. I kept the language factual. I did not explain the marriage. I did not explain the kitchen table. I just said, I did not send those emails. Then I looked up the graduate assistant coordinator's contact and wrote a separate note to her. Then I sat back and stared at my coffee and tried to decide what to do next. It occurred to me that I didn't actually know what legal category what my husband had done fell into. Accessing someone's email without permission, impersonating them, sending communications in their name to sabotage a professional opportunity. I didn't know if any of that was prosecutable or actionable or simply a terrible thing a person had done that the law had no particular interest in. So I found out. There was a legal aid clinic associated with Ohio State's law school that offered free consultations on family law matters. I called them at 9 when they opened. I got an appointment for that afternoon. I drove there directly. The attorney who met with me was a third-year law student named, well, I'll call her the attorney, because her name isn't mine to use. She was composed and methodical, and she listened without interrupting, which I have come to understand is rarer than it should be. When I finished, she folded her hands and asked me a few clarifying questions. Did I have documentation of the original acceptance? Yes, I had the email saved on my phone. Did I have any evidence that he had been on my laptop? His search history was still open on the browser when I walked in. Could I show the timestamp on his activity versus the timestamp of the emails sent? Probably, with help from someone who knew what they were doing. Then she told me something that I want every person reading this to hear clearly. She told me that accessing someone's email account without permission and using it to send communications they did not authorize is a violation of federal law under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. She said the impersonation, particularly when used to damage someone's professional or educational opportunities, could also constitute fraud. She said these were not minor things she was describing. She said the fact that the person who did it was my spouse did not change what it legally was. I sat in that office and felt my hands go cold. Not because I was afraid. Because for the first time in 3 days, what had happened to me had a name. It had a legal category. It existed in a framework that had nothing to do with whether my husband thought he knew me better than I knew myself. It existed in a framework where what he had done was simply plainly documentably wrong. She connected me with a family law attorney in private practice who took cases on sliding scale fees. That attorney, who I will call my lawyer because that is what she became, met with me the following day. She was direct in a way that I found steadying rather than harsh. She explained my options clearly. She said that the emails sent from my account could likely be challenged with the right documentation, and a letter from her office sent on my behalf to the university. explaining the circumstances and requesting reinstatement. She said that on the family law side, what had happened was a form of coercive control, and that I had options there too if I wanted to explore them. I want to be honest here about something, because I think the honest version is more useful than the clean version. When she said the words coercive control, I felt something shift inside me that I didn't entirely expect. Not shock exactly, more like the sensation of a word landing on a bruise I hadn't known was there. I had spent 3 years in a marriage with a man who made me feel, consistently and effectively, that my perceptions of things were slightly off, that I was too sensitive, that I was too ambitious, that I wanted too much, and gave too little thought to what my wanting cost the people around me. I had absorbed those adjustments the way you absorb a slow change in temperature, without noticing how cold it had gotten until you were already shivering. Sitting in that office, I said it out loud for the first time. I said I didn't think what was happening in my marriage was normal. She nodded and told me I was not the first person to say that to her in that office, and she was quite sure I would not be the last. I left with a folder of paperwork and a list of next steps that felt, for the first time in days, like actual ground under my feet. My lawyer's letter went out to the University of Michigan's admissions office and graduate school coordinator within 48 hours. It explained the situation factually and legally. It included a formal request for reinstatement, attached to supporting documentation that I had gathered with help from a tech consultant the clinic referred me to, a woman who was able to pull the access logs from my email account and demonstrate, with timestamps and IP addresses, that the emails had been sent from a device other than my own phone, and from a location I had not been at during the relevant time window. It was my husband's work laptop. He had forgotten, or not considered, that his work device logged every site visit. I did not tell my husband any of this was in motion. I went home each evening. I cooked dinner twice that week because my body needed the rhythm of something ordinary. I answered his questions about my day with short, accurate sentences. I watched him settle back into normal. I watched him believe that the thing he had done was finished, resolved, absorbed. He thought the chapter was closed. He did not know I had started a different book entirely. The response from Michigan came 8 days later. The associate dean of the graduate school emailed me directly. I was sitting in the same coffee shop where I had written those first emails, because I had started going there every morning as a kind of personal ritual, a small act of reclaiming something that was mine. I opened her email and read it twice. She said that based on the documentation provided and the legal correspondence they had received, the university was prepared to reverse the withdrawal on my record and reinstate my admission for the upcoming fall semester. She said the graduate assistant position had been offered to another student during the gap, but that they would put me on priority consideration for the following funding cycle. She said she wanted to personally acknowledge that what I had experienced was not something any student should have to navigate, and that she hoped things were moving in a better direction for me. I closed my laptop and looked out the window for a little while. Then I called my lawyer. Then I went home and I told my husband I was filing for divorce. He didn't believe me at first. He actually laughed, a short, disbelieving sound, and said I was overreacting. He said I was making a decision out of emotion. He said we could work through this, that he had done what he did because he loved me, that love sometimes looked like making hard choices for the people you loved when they couldn't make those choices for themselves. I told him that I had spoken with an attorney. I told him that what he had done had a legal name. I told him that I had documentation. I said it without raising my voice, because I had run out of the kind of energy that fuels raised voices. What I had left was something quieter and harder, and I think he heard it, because his face changed. He did not try to stop me from leaving that night. I went to stay with my older sister, who had always been skeptical of him in the particular way that sisters often know things before you're ready to know them yourself. I sat on her couch and told her everything, and she made tea and didn't say I told you so even once, which is one of the things I love most about her. The divorce took 7 months. It was not simple. He contested things he had no reasonable claim to contest, possibly as a tactic, possibly because he genuinely could not believe that what he had done did not entitle him to something. My lawyer was steady throughout. I kept a second spreadsheet, this one tracking legal costs, and the timeline of proceedings, because structure has always been the thing I reach for when everything else is unstable. In the meantime, I deferred my enrollment at Michigan by 1 semester, which the graduate school allowed given the documented circumstances. I found a sublet in Ann Arbor through a grad student housing listserv and paid first and last from my savings, which were still intact because the joint account we shared had contained only his direct deposits, and the account he never knew existed was entirely mine. That detail matters. I opened a separate account 2 years into the marriage because something in me, some quiet voice I kept not quite listening to, had decided to hedge. I don't know what I thought I was protecting against at the time. I know now. I moved to Ann Arbor on a Wednesday in January. My sister helped me carry boxes. We ordered pizza and sat on the floor of an apartment that smelled like paint and possibility. And she said, "You know what I think?" And I said, "What?" And she said, "I think you're going to be really, really good at this." And I started crying in a way that surprised me, because it didn't feel like grief anymore. It felt like something finally having enough room to move. The semester started the following Monday. I threw myself into it the way I had always thrown myself into things that mattered to me, completely, without reservation, taking notes that covered both sides of the page and staying late in the library, because I could. Because no one was waiting at home to make me feel guilty for being there. Because the hours were mine, and I could spend them however my mind needed them spent. I was 3 weeks into the semester, when the thing happened that I wasn't prepared for. I was coming out of my research methods class on a Tuesday afternoon, moving fast because I had a supervision meeting in 20 minutes, and the building was a 10-minute walk across campus. I was not paying full attention to where I was going, which is how I nearly walked directly into one of the advisors from the admissions office who had been involved in processing my reinstatement. She recognized me before I recognized her. She called my name, and I stopped and turned around, and it took me a second to place her face. She said she was glad she'd run into me. She said she had been the one to pull my original file when the reinstatement request came in. She said she remembered my application from the first round, because she had been on the committee that flagged it for the merit scholarship consideration, the one I had ultimately not received because I had been admitted in a cycle where the funding ran out before my file came up. She said she was sorry about that the timing had been genuinely unlucky. And then she said something I was not ready for. She said that there was a small scholarship fund through the School of Social Work, endowed by an alumna who had specifically designated it for students who had faced significant personal barriers to continuing their education. She said the committee met in the spring. She said she thought my circumstances were exactly what the fund had been established to address, and she wanted to make sure I knew it existed. She handed me a business card with the scholarship coordinator's contact information handwritten on the back. I stood on the sidewalk in 20-degree January air and looked at this card for a moment. Then I looked at her and said, "Thank you," in a voice that came out smaller than I intended, because the gratitude was too large to fit inside a normal speaking voice. She smiled and said she hoped things were going well, and she turned and walked back toward the administration building, and I stood there for another few seconds before I remembered I had a supervision meeting to get to. I applied for the scholarship in March. I wrote the personal statement in 2 sittings and cried during both of them, not because it was painful to write, but because writing it required me to look directly at the shape of everything that had happened, the whole arc of it, from acceptance email to divorce, filing to January sidewalk, and see it clearly for the first time all at once. I was awarded the scholarship in April. It covered my remaining tuition. I graduated 2 years later with my MSW and a clinical specialization in trauma-informed care. I passed my licensing exam on the first attempt. I now work at a counseling center in Ann Arbor, where I see individual clients, most of them women, many of them in situations that have architecture I recognize. My ex-husband and I have not spoken since the divorce was finalized. That is not a wound I am tending, or a war I am still fighting. It is simply the accurate description of where things stand. Some endings don't come with dramatic confrontations or final words or moments of acknowledged wrongdoing. Sometimes the person who hurt you never fully understands what they did or why it was what it was. Sometimes the ending is paperwork and silence and a Tuesday morning when you realize you haven't thought about them in 3 weeks. I used to think I needed him to understand, to see it. To say, "I know what I did, I know what I took from you, I'm sorry." I spent a lot of energy in the early months after I left waiting for that, checking my phone for a message that never came in the shape I wanted it. What I have now instead is this. I am a licensed clinical social worker. I sat with a client last week who told me she felt like she had disappeared inside her marriage, and I told her that I heard her, and I meant it in a way that is not theoretical. I have rebuilt a financial life from a spreadsheet I kept in a coffee shop at 6 in the morning. I have a one-bedroom apartment with plants that are still alive, and a bookshelf organized by subject, and a standing desk I bought for myself because I wanted one. I saved for 4 years and worked towards something with my whole self, and someone tried to take it from me by sitting down at my own kitchen table and clicking send, and I got it back anyway. If that story found you today, I want you to know something. There are frameworks for what is done to you. There are names for things. There are people whose job it is to help you understand what you're dealing with and what your options are, and those people exist specifically because what happened to me has happened to other people and will happen again, and the law, imperfect as it is, has something to say about it. You are allowed to know your rights. You are allowed to know them before you need them. You are allowed to build a life that belongs entirely to you, and if someone tries to take that from you, you are allowed to take it back. Subscribe if this story moved you, because every week we share real stories of people who faced something that should have ended them and didn't let it. You don't want to miss what's coming next.